talk for a little bit, and then anyone can ask questions.
Thank you, Maggie. And I don't know what order to do this in. Let's start here. I'm sorry to be late, but thank you so much for being here, for your interest, and for staying, and for your patience. What I'm going to do is keep my opening comments super short to make sure we have time for all the questions everybody wants to ask. The bad news is it took me forever to get here. The good news is I'm here until the last person leaves. So here's the deal. I'm Daniel Biss. I'm state senator in the 9th District, which is just north of the city of Chicago. I'm running for governor of Illinois, and none of this was the plan. I fell in love with math when I was 14 years old, because y'all know how teenagers can be. And I found myself teaching at the University of Chicago in 2002, and that was like my dream job, the only thing I ever wanted to do. And then 6 months later, we're heading off to war in Iraq. We have a president who's lying to us. Our national integrity is in danger. The globe is spinning out of control. And there's this movement of people rising up to do something about it. And I felt like I had to be a part of that. And so I just started organizing. Started going door to door and working with people to try to make political change. And I just fell in love with this idea that you could build political movements to transform societies. And that moment changed my life. That's what led me to run for the legislature, and that's what brought me into politics. So I've been in the legislature since 2011, and now here we are in 2017. We have a president who's lying to us, who's imperiling the national integrity. The globe is spinning out of control, and I look back and I think, if only I'd known back in 2002 and 2003 how much worse it could get. If only I'd known how much more dangerous things could be. But also, if only I'd known how much more robust and passionate and powerful the movement of people building across the country to transform our society could be. And that observation is what brought me into this race. Because, and I'll be really quick here, but understand this, our state is in terrible trouble. We haven't had a budget for 2 years. So what does that mean? It means schools don't know if they're going to open next fall. It means 80,000 people have lost access to mental health care, 24,000 have lost access to substance abuse treatment, 130,000 young people who were promised tuition assistance from the state now don't know if it's going to show up, and a lot of them have left school because they can't afford the instability. This is about people's futures, and it's about life and death. And Bruce Rauner has failed, and we need a new governor. But I think we should also be honest about the fact that it's not like things were perfect when Bruce Rauner became governor. And so we don't fund our universities at all anymore, but tuition was already too high when Bruce Rauner became governor. We don't have a budget at all right now, but our tax system was already one of the most progressive in the country when Bruce Rauner became governor, and our school funding system was the worst in the country when Bruce Rauner became governor. And this is the legacy not of what Rauner's done or of what Republicans have done, but of a broken system of machine politics we've had for decades in this state, where decisions were made in Springfield, not for most of us, not based on what we, the people of Illinois, need, but based upon what a few people, whether it's a millionaire or a billionaire or a owner of a particular political institution or machine, want for themselves. And that's what got us to this moment. And so in my opinion, the question we need to be asking ourselves is not simply, what does it take to beat Bruce Rauner? It's how do we beat Bruce Rauner and transform that broken system of machine politics that got us in this situation in the first place? How do we take power back for the rest of us? And the only way to do that is to build a movement of people across the state prepared to stand up and take power back. And that, I think, is possible now in 2017 and hopefully 2018 because of this hunger for activism that we see all over the state. I think it provides us with an opportunity to transform the state of Illinois in a way that we have not had for a long time, to do things that we've known we needed to do for a long time. And that observation is what brought me into this race for governor. And that observation is why I think that we have a really unique moment before us, a moment to transform our tax system so that finally millionaires and billionaires who've been the beneficiaries of 2 generations of economic growth and are not paying their share will finally be asked to pay their share so we can have a state government that works. A state government that funds schools properly, that makes child care available, that makes college education available, that funds health care properly, that raises wages and lifts people up and grows the middle class, and does it while transforming our political system to take the pernicious role of corporate money and big money out of our politics. That's what's at stake in this moment, and that's why I think this race is so crucial. And so I'm really, really excited to have a chance to be with y'all tonight, and that's enough out of me. I'd love to hear your questions, your comments, your thoughts, your suggestions, your ideas, and your concerns as well. Go ahead, you first.
Hi, I'm Fredo Villos, and in the news recently, California has tried to make single payer for the state. I believe Nevada has done the same thing as well. I was wondering, is it feasible that Illinois should follow suit and do something similar? Is there a large enough pool for something for us to do single payer for Illinois?
Great question. The question is, hey, California's Senate passed a single payer health care bill just a few days ago. Can't we do that in Illinois? So let me start here. What's the right way to do health insurance? Single payer. It's the best way to do health insurance. In the United States of America, we spend more on health care than any other country in the world, and frankly, we don't get much more back. And one of the most important reasons why that's true is that the health insurance private for-profit industry is sitting like a vacuum cleaner sucking money out of the system. That will be fixed if we go to a single payer system. It's the right thing to do. Your specific question, does Illinois have enough scale to have a big enough pool to have a working single payer system? You bet it does. You bet it does. We've got 13 million people here. If we were our own country, we would be one of the 20 biggest economies in the world. You bet we're big enough for that. Next question, do we have the money for that right now? You bet we don't. You bet we don't. And so if we want to have a single payer system in Illinois, and I want to have a single payer system in Illinois, we've got to fix our tax system. We have to make bold, transformative change to our tax system so we ask the richest residents to pay their share and allow us to have a healthcare system that works. Because guess what? Here's the bad news. If we try to use the current tax system, the current tax structure we have to fund a single payer system, that would be really punishing for the middle class and the working poor. It's not the right way to do it. And so I would say step 1, reform the tax system. Step 2, use those reforms to bring in enough revenue. To step 3, set up a state-level single payer healthcare system so we truly have utterly universal healthcare for all in Illinois. Other questions? Yep. You bet. So the question was, well, let me try to rephrase the question a little bit, and you tell me if I'm getting it wrong. The way I would interpret the question is, hey, listen, we've got 300 plus million people in America. It's a giant, diverse, complicated country, and we've got 2 political parties. And so sometimes it can be hard for important voices to really be heard in that 2-party system. How can we transform our electoral system to make sure that all voices are heard? Is that fair? So I introduced a bill this session, and it was not a bill that the kind of party leaders were so crazy about, and it sets up a system of what's called instant runoff voting. And I want you all to stay with me for a second. It's a little bit in the weeds, but it's meaningful. The way instant runoff voting works is if more than 2 candidates run, like if, you know, I don't know, let's say Bush and Gore and Nader run, your ballot doesn't just say I'm for Bush or I'm for Gore or I'm for Nader. Instead, your ballot ranks those candidates. So maybe you might say my first choice is Gore, my second choice is Nader, my third choice is Bush. Or maybe you might say my first choice is Nader, my second choice is Gore, my third choice is Bush. And then when the votes are counted, the first thing they do is they say, hey, how many first place votes does each candidate get? And so that would be like 49.9% for Gore, 49.9% for Bush, 49.8% for Gore, and 0.3% for Nader. And then you'd say, wait, none of them got 50%, we got to do another round. We crossed Nader off and we redistribute his vote. So the folks who went Nader, Bush, somebody get redistributed to Bush, and the folks who went Nader, Gore, Bush get redistributed to Gore. In other words, you cross Nader off the list and then reassign his votes to whoever is first place among the remaining candidates for his voters. And then you recount and see if someone gets 50%. If so, they're the winner. If not, you repeat. Okay, why is this man standing in front of you going through all this? What is the purpose of this system? The purpose of the system is that instead of then saying, hey, nobody should vote for Nader, he's a spoiler candidate, you allow people to say, my first choice is Nader, but guess what? If he doesn't win, I'd rather have Gore than Bush. You allow people to express all of their preferences, and that elevates the voices of non-traditional parties and activists and other entities in democracy. The system we have now instead pushes out all other voices, and it makes it hard for us to have a system that truly reflects the diversity of our country and the diversity of the people and the views that exist in our state, and by the way, in every community of our state. So I've introduced that bill because I support it. It's something I think is worth fighting for. It did not pass, but guess what? Maine has done it. It's been enacted in the state of Maine, and their next election, I believe, is slated to happen to be held with instant runoff voting. And to the other part of your question, the like voting theorists, and there are such people, the voting theorists have a lot of different ideas of how to run an election. Instant runoff voting is one of them. There's something called Condorcet voting. There's another one. You mentioned another one I hadn't even heard of. I can't tell you for sure that instant runoff voting specifically is the best one. What I can tell you is that we've got 13 million people in Illinois, and a lot of them, maybe most of them, feel like their voices aren't really heard in the state capitol in Springfield. We have a responsibility to make structural reforms to the plumbing that underlies our system to make sure that as many people as possible have their voices heard in the legislative process. It is one of the great catch-22s of political reform that the people who need to vote for the changes are probably benefiting from the system the way that it's structured right now. And that's not only a problem with this. I'll tell you, one of the first things I did when I became a legislator was I introduced a constitutional amendment that says you can't be Speaker of the House or Senate President for more than 10 years. I thought that was a pretty good idea. But what problem was that trying to solve? The problem was that the Speaker of the House was too powerful. He got to decide if that bill got called for a vote. Guess what happened? So we have to figure out ways to reform our system and then persuade the people who are currently in power to do it. And the only way I know of to do that is to really build pressure from the public. If the public pushes hard enough, the politicians will have to follow. If the public says, this is a nice idea, but I'm not really prepared to fight for it, the politicians will know that they can get away with just kicking the can down the road and never making any change. I'm fighting for another, I think, really crucial election reform item that is kind of in this category too. And this is about what I think is the most important crisis in our democracy right now, which is money in politics. Money in politics. So I introduced a bill that I passed out of the Senate to create what's called a small donor matching system. How does that work? It says if you're going to run for office, you can finance your campaign one of two ways. If you want, you can continue to finance your campaign in the old way of big contributions from millionaires and billionaires and corporate interests. Or, if you prefer, you can opt into the other system, which means, number one, you volunteer to accept much lower limits on your contributions. But on the other hand, the small contributions that you get are matched 6-to-1. So if someone makes a $25 contribution, that actually becomes a $175 contribution, and that lifts up the voices of ordinary people and depresses the influence of big money in our politics. By the way, New York City has this for their elections, and when they enacted it, man, it worked instantaneously. Their city council got younger, more progressive, more politically independent, more ethnically diverse. In other words, more like the people. And so this is something that we could do. It's not a fantasy, it's not a pipe dream, it's real. It got out of the Senate, but the House still hasn't voted for it. If we believe that that's a fundamental transformation that we need in our politics, we've got to push like crazy to make sure the House passes that bill. We've got to call our representatives, write our representatives, make sure all of our friends and neighbors and colleagues do the same so that they feel a sense of pressure that they've got to do this. And once they feel that they've got to do this, then eventually the change will happen. But it requires organizing, it requires activism, it requires strategy, and guess what? It requires patience too. Next question?
Thank you. I have a two-part question.
Yep.
What is your position on private charter schools, and have you ever received funding from private charter schools?
The question is, what's my position on private charter schools, and have I ever received funding from private charter schools? I'm 100% against private charter schools in all circumstances, and I'm for a complete moratorium on public charter schools as well. I think that we have a school funding crisis in Illinois. We're closing public schools. It's not time to open charter schools. I think it's a real mistake. I have not received any money from any public or private charter schools. I have received money from some supporters of charter schools, but my voting record, I think, speaks for itself. I voted, for example, just last week for a bill to eliminate the role that something called the Charter School Commission plays in Springfield. And let me walk you through that. Here's what the Charter School Commission does. If a charter operator wants to start a charter school, they go to the school board and say, hey, can we have a charter school here? And the school board says yes or no. And that should be the end of it. Except that if the school board says no, then the charter can appeal to this thing called the Charter School Commission, and if the Charter School Commission grants the appeal, then even though the local school district didn't want the charter school to start there, it happens anyway and starts diverting money out of the rest of the public schools. I think that's a mistake. I think it's a bad idea, and I voted for a bill to eliminate that. That bill, by the way, is now on the way to Governor Rauner's desk. Governor Rauner, you should sign that bill. So I don't think that my voting record is, I think my voting record speaks for itself, but it's true there are some people who support charters who also support me for a variety of other reasons, and I'm certainly happy to be honest about that. Yeah, thank you. The question is, listen, Illinois is in trouble. What's your plan to fix it? And unfortunately, we've got to have a short-term plan and a long-term plan. The short-term plan is we've got to get a budget immediately. We've got to stop the bleeding. We've got to stop the pain. We have to stop shutting down mental health facilities and domestic violence shelters, and we have to stop racking up $11 million of additional debt per day and watching the interest rate that we pay on bonds go through the roof. We have to stop all that, and that's going to require some pretty unpleasant compromises. But the long-term plan has to start with fixing our broken tax structure. Because what we've done, not just for the last 2.5 years, but for decades, is we've been unable to afford the government that we want and that we deserve because our tax structure is antiquated. In fact, our tax structure is written by a government that's owned by the very wealthy, and that's left us unable to have a balanced budget that also funds what we need to fund. And so there's a few things I want to say about how to fix the tax structure. The first thing is that we have to repeal the flat tax provision of the Illinois Constitution. That's the most important thing we can do to fix our budget. In Illinois, the Constitution says that our income tax has to be flat, which means that if you make $20,000 a year, we've got to tax you at the same rate as if you make $20 million a year, or $188 million a year like Bruce Rauner did in 2015. We're one of only 4 states that has this. One of only 4 states. And on the federal level, they tax the lowest income at 10% and the highest at 39.6%. So this is a really weird, anomalous thing in our Illinois Constitution, and what it's meant over the course of the almost 50 years since it was put in there in 1970 is that as more and more and more of the income has gone to the very top, as middle class people have not gotten a raise, as the working poor have actually seen their pay decrease in some cases, we haven't been able to get the money where it is at the top without punishing everybody else as well. And it's left us in an unfair situation, in a situation where we're always chasing to find the revenue we can, and often it's been found in places that have not been fair to the middle class. So that's number one. Repeal the constitutional provision that says we have to have a flat tax. But I would say we shouldn't stop there. I passed a bill out of the Senate a couple weeks ago that made the Illinois Senate the first legislative chamber in the country to repeal what's called the carried interest tax loophole. Now, this is a little bit technical, but it's an important issue. The carried interest loophole is a loophole in the federal tax code that allows private equity and hedge fund billionaires to literally, this sounds like I'm making it up, but it's true, to literally reclassify their income as though it's not income, and therefore get a 20% tax cut. And these are literally hedge fund billionaires, some of the richest people in the history of the world. They're getting this completely corrupt, dishonest 20% tax cut. And by the way, not only did Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump and Jeb Bush during the campaign say that loophole should be repealed, but so do most people running for Congress. And then somehow Donald Trump and his Goldman Sachs cabinet and Paul Ryan and his right-wing Congress have not gotten around to repealing that loophole. My attitude is we shouldn't wait. We shouldn't wait for Washington to get that one right. We should repeal it here on the state level, raise an extraordinary amount of money, and use that money to fund Illinois government and fix our budget hole. That's not the only idea. Here's something else. A lot of people who are concerned about social justice and criminal justice reform ask me about our marijuana laws. I think we need to legalize recreational use of marijuana. I'm a co-sponsor of the bill to do that. I think that's a matter of racial justice. It's a matter of racial justice because of the way that our laws are completely unequally applied to people in communities of color and people in affluent white communities. I also think it's a matter of common sense because prohibition isn't working. It's not solving the public health problems associated with drug use, so why continue it? But guess what else? If we were to legalize the recreational use of marijuana and then tax it, that would be useful for our budget also. So I think that we need to think about bold, aspirational plans to bring in truly adequate revenue in new, different ways and break out of the broken tax system that was written by millionaires and billionaires for millionaires and billionaires that got us to the situation that we're currently in. Question is, what would be my plan for property taxes? How long do you have? Our property tax system stinks.
Yeah.
Our property taxes are too high.
Yeah.
They're the second highest of any state in the country. That is a tax that punishes the middle class. It punishes people on fixed incomes. And by the way, it results in a very inequitable school funding system. So let's start here. Let's start here. We need to fund our schools the right way by having a fair tax system that brings in enough revenue to the state by taxing people who can actually afford to pay, that the state can then have a sensible school funding formula like dozens and dozens of other states in the union, and that will allow us to bring down our local property tax rates in total. But that's not the only thing we have to do. I don't know how many of you guys have been following the story in the Chicago Tribune for the last week or so about property taxes. For those of you who haven't, here's the cliff notes of this pretty interesting multi-part series that's been running in the Tribune. Part one, our property tax assessments are completely unfair and capricious and regressive. Regressive, which means that on average, the poor are over-assessed and pay too much, while the rich are under-assessed and pay too little. Too little. That's number one. Number two, the Cook County assessor, I can't speak to Kane County and the various townships here, but the Cook County assessor knows this and has chosen to do nothing about it, even though a tool was created for him to address the problem. And number three, the property tax appeal system is so completely screwed up that it makes this problem worse, not better. So that's a pretty bad fact pattern, and we've got to put a stop to that. We have to put a stop to the politically connected ability to get your own property taxes cut, and we have to have an assessment system that's truly accurate, that doesn't punish the poor, and that it's truly transparent too. Because here's the worst part, in my opinion, about that Tribune story. The Tribune reporters kept asking the assessor, hey, explain how you came to this conclusion. Show us your model, show us your system, show us your algorithm. And the response was, no, we're not going to do that. Imagine if your income taxes were like that. Imagine if on tax day, instead of you filling out your return based on what you actually made, the government sent you a bill saying, hey, you're 43 years old, and here's where you went to college, and here's your zip code, so we think you owe $12,000. And you would say, but that's not actually what I made. And they would say, doesn't matter. We're going to tell you what you owe. And we're not going to tell you how we calculated it. Good luck. So this kind of system is just ripe for abuse. It allows people who can hire fancy lawyers to have huge breaks in their tax cuts. It allows people who are politically connected to have access to categories of help and assistance that nobody else has. It's a rotten system, and we need to completely reform it by taking out the subjectivity, using fair models, making them totally transparent, and getting the politics out of the appeal process as well. But again, that has to be on top of a fair system of funding our schools that relies on taxing millionaires and billionaires so that the state has adequate resources to allow districts to bring their total property tax levies down. Great question. So the question is, what do you do about income inequality? And there's a lot to say. I'll try to be quick here. One aspect, and let's just be clear. The question is totally right. Income inequality is through the roof. It's dangerous. It's not just immoral. It's not just unfair. It's dangerous for a civilized society. It's dangerous for a democracy. It's dangerous, dangerous, dangerous. So we've got to do something about it. So there's a few categories of things. First category of thing that I would say is government needs to lift people up. So I was a very proud co-sponsor of a $15 an hour minimum wage bill that passed the Senate and the House late in May. It's time for Governor Rauner to sign that bill. That will make a big, big difference. But I don't think we ought to stop there. I don't think we ought to stop there. We need to have a policy of earned sick time, so that people don't have to go to work sick or stay home and lose their pay or risk losing their job. We need a sane policy of paid family leave. Paid family leave. It's absurd that we're the only industrialized country that tells people, hey, you have an infant at home, and by the way, you got to go to work now that your infant's 3 days old. It's ridiculous. It's immoral. And people in the upper middle class aren't subjected to that, but low-wage workers are. We have to have better laws about overtime and fair scheduling and flex time. There are a lot of different specific laws that can be put in place to stop the kinds of abuses that low-wage workers are subject to and improve their quality of life as well as their earning power. So that's number one. Number two, we have one institution in the history of American life that has been a very successful bulwark against the growing economic inequality. What is that institution? The labor union. The labor union. So first of all, we have to fight back against attacks on collective bargaining. We have to fight back against attacks on union organizing. We have to support organizing drives. But I think we also have to acknowledge that the economy has changed a lot, and we haven't totally figured out how to bring the new economy into the world of collective bargaining and union representation. And so as there's more and more Uber drivers, we shouldn't just accept that as okay and say that your life as an Uber driver is going to mean you negotiating on yourself with a giant faceless corporation that's headquartered in California. We should build new models of solidarity that allow workers in the so-called sharing economy, or workers who are hired by staffing agencies which act as an intermediary between the worker and the workplace and therefore take away workers' rights. We should build new mechanisms of organizing that enable these workers who are currently being exploited to band together and fight for themselves. I think that's a crucial, crucial thing, and we haven't totally figured out exactly how to do it, but we've got to figure it out. And the last thing I would say speaks to your direct question is, what do you do about opportunity? Well, there's a lot of things that need to be done about opportunity. Number one, let's be honest for a second, the state of Illinois has walked away from regions of the state. There are places that are booming, and there are places that are forgotten. And we need to invest everywhere. We need to understand that economic opportunity relies in some cases on public investment. And when the government has walked away from a given neighborhood for generations and closed schools and allowed jobs to leave, it's time for us to solve that problem, not with a theory or a promise, but with direct investment by putting people to work in a job in exchange for which they get paid a living wage. We have to do that directly as opposed to assuming someone else will do it. But we also need to make sure that the right kind of education is properly affordable. So let's think about this for a second. A century ago, we made a decision as a society. We said, listen, to have a truly equal shot at a middle-class life, most people need a high school degree. So we'll create a free system of elementary and secondary education. And we did it. And thank God we did. Well, now it's 2017, and guess what? Most people, to have a truly equal shot at a middle-class life, need some kind of post-secondary certification. It doesn't need to be a four-year degree necessarily. It can be a community college degree or an associate's degree or a certification from a vocational or trade school. But for most people, something beyond a high school degree is necessary to have an equal shot at a middle-class life. So what does that mean? It means it's time for us to make college free as well. And if we do all of these things together, the dramatic and grotesque increase in economic inequality will be reversed. Yeah, and I'm not sure I heard the question. I'm going to answer what I think was the question, and if I didn't get it right, just tell me. Well, the way I kind of, the umbrella that I put the question under is what we call fair scheduling laws. And you know, so we have right now people who, let's say they might get called to work, and per your example, they get called to work, and when they show up, they said, never mind, your shift got canceled, go home, you're paid zero. Is that what you're talking about? That's one example. It's not the only example. There'll be an example of, for instance, someone will be told, you have to be on call for the next 3 days, and we'll call you at 8 in the morning each day and tell you whether or not to come. So if you've got another part-time job, you can't be scheduled for any of the next 3 days, but you're only going to get paid for one of the three, probably. Or maybe we're a coffee shop or a restaurant that's open late and open early, and we're going to make you clopen it. You're going to close the restaurant, which means you don't get to go home until 3, and then you're going to open it, which means you got to be there at 5. And hey, I hope you spend the hours from 3 a.m. to 5 a.m. really effectively, because you're not going to get paid. So these kinds of rules that put the worker at the mercy of the business, that in some cases are the result of incredibly sophisticated software that's been written to squeeze as much out of workers as possible, they make it impossible to live. They make it impossible to raise a family. What the hell are you going to do about childcare? If you need to be on call always, but you're only going to get paid for a third of the days. What are you going to do about childcare if you get called for a shift, you line up the babysitter, you show up, and then you find out once you're there, 0 hours, 0 pay? How are you going to pay for that? And so there are states that have begun to pass strong fair scheduling laws. that say that if you get a shift canceled in less than 24 hours, you're going to get paid anyhow, so that you can afford childcare. That say you have to have a certain amount of notice, so if it's only a part-time job, you can have 2 different part-time jobs and schedule both. I've been fighting for this in Springfield, and I'll tell you what, it's a tough battle, and you know why. But we have to do it. It's another part of that mix of laws we have to pass if we want to lift people up, protect workers, and make sure that the equation that we like to dream about of the connection between work and a dignified middle-class family life is actually there. So I'm all for it. I'm going to be fighting for it. We're going to go you and then the Bernie T-shirt and then there. Yeah, thank you. The question was, hey, I teach at Northern Illinois University, and I see the higher education system in our state almost kind of being dismantled before my very eyes. Unfortunately, I think it's more or less what you said. So what do you do? What do you do? Well, let's start here. It sounds obvious, but it deserves being said out loud. We need to have a budget. We need to have a budget. Not having a budget is evil and wrong, but it affects different parts of the public sector differently. And the 2 areas that have been most viciously harmed are higher education and social services. And there's been no money at all for higher education for big swaths of this nightmare. And that's left, I mean, where do you start? It's left Chicago State University last year, they canceled their spring break. Why did they do that? Because they thought they might have to close their doors altogether, and if they canceled spring break, then graduation would be a week earlier, therefore increasing the odds that they would make it to graduation and make sure their students would at least get that diploma. Northeastern Illinois University, which caters particularly to first-generation students, they've got their faculty on a 20% furlough. Canceling lots of days. Canceling lots of days. There are faculty, I'm sure at Northern and all the public institutions, who are being poached by other states. Faculty who may say, listen, I don't really want to move to Wisconsin, but I'd like to be at a place that I know is going to be there in 10 years, so I might as well go. And so this is a nightmarish tragedy, and it's done, people say that Bruce Rauner has been a bad governor. He's been a great governor for the University of Wisconsin. He's been a great governor for the University of Iowa. And he's been a nightmare for higher education in Illinois. And because we're therefore exporting students, he's been a terrible governor for the long-term economic health of Illinois. So we've got to have a budget. But then we need to say a few things. Number one, the higher education funding system the day before Bruce Rauner became governor was not good enough. The previous decade had been very hard on higher education because of a political system that's not that responsive to anybody who doesn't have an effective lobbyist in Springfield. And so we need to fund higher education much more robustly for tuition reasons and for hiring reasons and for research reasons and for everything else. And we need to focus, to your question about expanding opportunity, we need to focus our next tranches of funding on making sure they're going to the places where they're maximally increasing opportunity of young people who may not otherwise have the chance to have a higher education. So for one thing, I will freely admit that making all public institutions tuition free is not something that's going to happen like this. It's not. But guess what we could do a lot faster than most people think? Free community college. We can do that a lot faster than most people think. And there you're looking at the first ladder. The first rung of the ladder that is disproportionately used by first-generation students, immigrant students, students who are children of immigrants, students of color, lots and lots and lots and lots of single parents trying to cobble together an education while working to improve their own economic situation and that of their children. And then that additional layer of $3,000 to $4,000 of tuition can be enough to be an unsurmountable obstacle. Let's get rid of that. Let's get rid of that first. We can create opportunities to have much more robust need-based tuition assistance. We have something called the MAP grant, Tuition Assistance in Illinois, that is a good program that used to be one of the most generous in the country. And it's shrunk and shrunk and shrunk. When it was introduced, it met all of the need. Think of it, all of the need. And now, the majority of students who have need don't get any money, and those that do get money have typically around half, on average, or less of their need met. We could put money into that to make sure that the neediest students are not finding tuition an obstacle to an ability to get a public higher education in the state of Illinois. And then we can, on top of that, work to bring down tuition over time and get to a place where we have tuition free. But I completely agree, that's a long-term project. Therefore, it's got to be phased in. When we think about the phase-in, let's make the first steps the ones that are highest impact for those young people who, if not for the first step we might take, would otherwise not have a chance at an education. So I think you're next, and then you. I'm really sorry, I'm not hearing you. Do you mind stepping forward? And I apologize, but do you mind starting again?
You have a plan to reform the tax increment financing system and the use of sales tax rebates that benefit large developers and box store retailers and hurt little independent retailers?
You bet. The question is, do I have a plan to reform the tax increment financing, or TIF system, and then also the system of sales and, frankly, other tax rebates that are typically utilized by large developers and connected entities and are harmful to everybody else. So, listen, here's how taxes work in Illinois. If you have a really good lobbyist, you're probably going to get a tax cut. If you're big enough to say, hey, I've got 5,000 employees and I'll leave unless you give me an unfair tax cut, you'll probably get it. And then what happens? What happens? Everybody else pays the difference. Everybody else makes up the difference. And what's one of the consequences of that? It's unfair, it's dumb, it's ugly, but it also kills entrepreneurs. It kills small businesses. It kills local businesses. The economy we want to have is an economy where there are small local businesses rooted in their community that have a chance of succeeding. But they're not competing on a level playing field because they're not big enough yet to hire a lobbyist and get themselves a tax cut that their bigger competitors get. And so the whole system needs to be reformed. And I can tell you from experience that when an employer comes to Springfield and says, here's my gun, there's your head, give us a tax cut or else we're leaving, it can be scary. And in my first years in Springfield, I didn't always stand up to them because I really didn't want the jobs to leave. And then I realized, you know what, you're participating in a race to the bottom. You're participating in a race to the bottom, and you have to be willing to stand up to these guys. And you have to be willing to say, no, we're not going to do it. And the way to solve that problem is to engage in regional leadership. To actually sit down with municipal leaders in the state of Illinois and say, hey guys, don't play that game against each other. And then to sit down with other states. And I'm not exactly excited about sitting down with Scott Walker, but that's what we're going to have to do. We're going to have to say, listen, when a small manufacturing plant goes back and forth between Kenosha and Zion and Kenosha and Zion and Kenosha and Zion, each time getting a bigger tax cut for the privilege of moving, neither of us wins. Neither of us wins. And we need to have these kinds of regional compacts. And there are examples. I think the Denver area, all of the municipalities got together and participated in a compact saying none of us are going to give out these tax breaks because we all lose when we all compete in the race to the bottom. When I'm governor, Illinois is going to be a leader in building that kind of agreement regionally so we can get out of this broken system and instead have a tax system where the big guys pay their share and then the new, small, local community business has a fair shot at success as well.
What do you think of austerity as the response of many countries and even states in our country to the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression, as opposed to like the New Deal FDR type of Keynesian response?
So the question is, what do I think about austerity as a response to the financial crisis, as opposed to a Keynesian response? Which I was actually a little bit concerned, because I don't feel like it's a good day unless I've been asked a question involving the word Keynesian. It's been until this evening I didn't get one, so now here we are. Well, it's insane. It's insane. We had a global financial crisis, which was not handled as well as it could have been either, by the way, but that's a different question, which led to a global recession unlike anything we'd experienced since the Great Depression. And the most important thing we needed to do as a globe was immediate fiscal stimulus, to put money in the economy, to put people to work directly. And lots of places did some of this. Obviously, the stimulus that was passed in, I think, February of 2009 did put a lot of money into the economy, but it wasn't nearly enough. And then instead of saying, hey guys, that wasn't enough, let's do more, the response was, hey guys, that wasn't enough, let's do the opposite now. And so this country pivoted to austerity, which meant lots of cuts, putting people out of work at the precise moment that we needed to be hiring. And lots of other countries did the same. And now we have this global agreement by which rich countries tell poor countries, you can't play in our sandbox unless you play our austerity game, which is cruel and counterproductive. So I think it's a terrible idea. Now you might ask, how is it connected to what we do in Springfield? The connections are not perfect because we don't have our own currency, we don't have our own central banking system, we don't have the ability to run short-term deficits for the purposes of stimulating the economy. So we have to maintain balanced budgets, and that's sort of not a Keynesian thing, right? It's a neutral thing rather than fiscally stimulative. But we still can ask ourselves, how do we balance our budget? Do we, during a time of economic contraction, that we need, a time during which we need to be putting money in people's pockets, do we tax the middle class and cut social services? Or do we tax the rich and invest in communities? And though that's not technically a Keynesian or non-Keynesian question, it's a pretty similar philosophy that says, let's tax the rich, who, by the way, spend a lot of their money all over the globe, not just in Illinois. So taxing the rich doesn't take so much money out of the Illinois economy. And then let's take that money and invest it directly in communities, invest it in schools, invest it in social services, invest it in construction projects for the infrastructure that we so terribly need, invest it in higher education. I think the lesson that we ought to be learning on the state level from Keynesian economics is that when you have that kind of moment of recession, you should tax the rich, take the money, invest it in communities to put people to work.
This question on that, we're going to talk about Keynes, but would you support a state bank in South Dakota against flexibility?
I walked right into that one. The question is, would I support a state bank, which does begin to create some opportunities for greater flexibility on fiscal policy? And the answer is yes, I do. In fact, the one state that has it, it works, North Dakota, I believe. It works remarkably well, and it's actually revenue positive for the state, but also kind of changes the vision of investment and changes the role that the community plays in driving investment in their own neighborhoods. And I think it's a very, very sound idea, as you can tell from the fact that it's worked very, very well for a number of decades. Did you ask about both guns and undocumented immigrants? Okay. So on the issue of guns, I'm a strong supporter of common sense gun safety regulation. I think the most important thing that we've done on this issue in Springfield of late, unfortunately, only passed the Senate, and that was a bill to license gun dealers. So let me say a word about this. Gun dealers in Illinois are totally unlicensed. And what that means is that if you look at, for example, the gun crimes committed in the city of Chicago, an overwhelming number of them are committed with guns that were purchased not in Chicago, but instead in either the suburbs or in Indiana or Wisconsin. And they're not just purchased in the suburbs, they're purchased at a few gun stores in the suburbs that we know where they are, but we can't do anything about it because we don't license gun dealers. So we passed a bill in the Senate to license gun dealers, and if the House passed that bill and if the governor signed it, it would be a really meaningful tool to curb illegal gun activity and to keep our streets safer. So I'm a strong supporter and co-sponsor of that, and I've supported a series of measures that I would characterize as very sensible, reasonable, common sense regulations to enhance our safety. And I think that we're seeing a real change on this issue, by the way. I think we're seeing a change on this issue. The NRA, I think, doesn't do a great job of speaking for most gun owners. The NRA does a really good job of speaking for the gun manufacturers that fund the NRA. And we're seeing, I think, the beginnings of a trend where more and more people across the political spectrum, including lots of gun owners, will no longer be attached to the kind of extreme views of the NRA and will be more and more open to reasonable and common sense gun safety legislation. So that's that. And on immigration, listen, if I were running for federal office, I would tell you I very strongly support comprehensive immigration reform with a path to citizenship for people here in the United States of America. If you ask what that means on the state level, it means a few things, actually. It means that I was supportive of something called the Illinois Dream Act to help Illinois higher education be more affordable for undocumented students, so-called dreamers. It means that I supported driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants because the traffic enforcement process is not supposed to be a deportation squad. And it means that I was a proud co-sponsor of something called the Trust Act that is now on the governor's desk. What is the Trust Act? It is a response to the grotesque and racist attacks of Donald Trump. It says that that municipal and state police are not going to cooperate with ICE in engaging in deportation raids. It says that the state of Illinois is not going to cooperate with the federal government in setting up a registry of Muslims. It says that you can call 911 or you can report a crime regardless of your immigration or documentation status. And these things seem like common sense things, but in a world where Donald Trump is engaging in the vicious and brutal attacks on immigrant and refugee communities, I think it's crucial for Illinois to stand strong in resistance and enact these concrete protections of immigrant communities who are, as you well know, right now terrified of what might be coming at them from the federal government.
How would you defend your past policies on the public pension crisis? Has your thinking on that issue evolved? How would you stay around on that issue?
Thank you for that question. So let me give, for the rest of the audience, a little bit of background. As you all know, there's been a long fight in Illinois about what to do about our very serious problem of pension debt. And I was supportive in 2013, I think it was, of legislation that changed pensions and that was since overturned by the Supreme Court. And so your question is like, how do you feel about that now? And what do you, like, where are you on that? And here's my answer. And I want you all to listen to this. This is important. I was wrong. I was wrong. And I want you to hear that because I think it's something that I owe people who might be concerned about that, a clear, unequivocal statement. But more important than that clear, unequivocal statement is I want to tell you what I learned from that. I arrived in Springfield in 2011, the depths of the Great Recession, and we had this huge budget problem. We'd been cutting education and Medicaid and social services, and the options that were kind of placed on my desk by the elites and the special interests and so forth were, hey, you can either keep on cutting services for the poor, or else you can start to change pension benefits. And I accepted those choices. And then once I accepted them, I tried to pick the least bad of the bad options that had been presented to me. And that was the wrong thing to do. The right thing to do would have been to say, those are not all the options. Those are not the only choices. The richest residents of Illinois have been getting richer and richer and richer and richer for 2 generations now, and we haven't been taxing them fairly. If we were to reform our tax system, tax millionaires and billionaires properly, we could afford both. We could afford to properly invest in schools and healthcare and social services and also to fund our pension system. But I didn't have the, I don't know if it's the courage or perhaps I just wasn't really thinking boldly enough to do that, and I was kind of quick to accept the options that were given to me. Now what I learned from that is that when the elites give you a few options, they're curating those options based upon their own self-interest. And my responsibility as a public official is not to just accept those choices, but if those choices aren't good enough, to say loudly and to say clearly, we're going to reject those and find a better option. We're going to find a better way based upon the money that we know is there that we have been choosing not to access. And that, I believe, is a governor that we ought to have. A governor who, when presented with some bad options, is willing to be bold, is willing to think outside the box, and is not going to just say, we'll take this one because I can't think of anything better right now. And you have my commitment going forward that that's going to be the way I'm going to act. So let me give you an example. When we had a budget vote in the Senate late in our session in late May, it was kind of a much better than nothing budget, but also kind of not that great budget, frankly. And so I saw that budget and I thought, well, there's voting no, which means accepting the status quo, or there's voting yes, which means accepting this not so great budget. That's better than nothing. But wait, should I just accept that as the best option? No, I shouldn't. There are better paths forward. And when I had that realization, that's when I decided to push as hard as I could to pass the carried interest tax loophole bill I talked about earlier. Because it wasn't good enough to just pick the less bad of the 2 options. It was my job to find the right thing to do, which is to find the revenue from people who have the money, have not been asked to pay their money, their fair share because of a truly corrupt tax loophole. And that's what you're going to see from me going forward. Is not just accepting the options on the table, but rejecting them when necessary and fighting for the right option.
Would you comment on Senator Omar Aquino's bill, SB 1970, for LaSalle Street tax?
Question is, will I comment on Senate Bill 1970, sponsored by my friend Omar Aquino, for LaSalle Street tax? I'm for it. I'm a co-sponsor of that bill. What does that bill do? It puts a very, very, very small tax on trades at the Chicago Board of Trade and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. A very small percentage. And so what does that tax do? Here's the first thing it does. It brings in a boatload of money, billions of dollars that we need. Second thing, who does it tax? Very rich people who are not currently paying their share. Third thing, what sort of behavior changes might it cause? Well, actually, guess what? One of the problems in the modern economy is we have too much high-frequency trading. It's done by computer algorithms, and it can be dangerous to our economy. It can cause sudden market crashes and radical economic fluctuations for no good reason. And so if you put a little tax on trades, you're actually going to be discouraging that behavior, which actually is problematic behavior. And so it's a win-win-win. It brings in revenue a lot. It taxes people who can truly afford to pay. And the only economic behavior it would change would be behavior that would actually improve behavior in a way that would make our economy run more smoothly. So I'm all for it. Any last questions?
Kennedy says that won't work because they'll just move the transactions off the screen.
Yeah, so some of the other candidates, you mentioned Chris Kennedy, he opposes that because he thinks it's not workable because they'll just move the exchange somewhere else to avoid the tax. I mean, the truth of the matter is that to build up an exchange and to build up the customer base takes time. You can't just set up a new exchange instantly and suck up all the customers from these exchanges that are there. And so there's a lot of investment of many, many, many decades and an incredible amount of resources to set up this particular marketplace. And I agree there's different people who think different things, but I've read a lot about this, and the overwhelming preponderance of the evidence that I've read suggests that because of all of the existing investment that's been put in having that exchange run the way it is, that this would not be the impact of that tax if it were levied in the same and kind of appropriate size manner.
You've got a lot of great ideas. I mean, I like everything you said today. My limit is under 8.6.
This is a small campaign, so everything's happening over time. The website is in development; it'll be ready soon. In the meantime, there's a very nice video there. Any one last question? The question is, what can we do about student loan debt? I actually passed a bill that's on the governor's desk right now. It's Senate Bill 1351 that goes after these student loan servicers. So here's how this works. You borrow money for your tuition, and that loan, which is more often than not a federal loan, though not always, then gets handled by a servicer, which is a private for-profit company. There's only 10 or 20 of them that really are active. And those companies, that's the company that you call if you have trouble paying your loan. That's the company that sends you the bill. That's where you send your check. And they have been now sued because of their behavior, where they basically try to get people who call off the phone as quickly as possible, and in doing so put them in expensive repayment plans, or don't tell them about the income-based repayment plans that are the tip for many students, the most cost-effective way of repaying their loan. It's a really, really unfortunate predatory situation. And so we passed what would be the strongest student loan bill of rights in the country if Governor Rauner signs it into law, to really curb this kind of predatory behavior of these servicers. In terms of the terms of the loans themselves, God knows that the federal government ought to be fixing this. It's really, really wrong. It's really immoral. I don't want to pretend I can do that from the state legislature myself. I can regulate, or from the governor's office, I can regulate the servicers, and I can work on tuition, and I can also work on tuition assistance, in other words, the MAP grant, which could be used to significantly decrease the exposure that Illinois students have to other loans that come with the kind of ugly terms they come with. And so I don't want to overpromise on what I can do to regulate the federal government's action in this, but the state can step in crucial ways. It's something I'm already doing, and I'll keep on doing more often. So I think we've exhausted everyone's willingness to ask questions. I just want to say thank you very much. And again, I'm sorry I was late. I really appreciate the patience you guys had in waiting for me. I appreciate the time you put in, the questions, the discussion. And I'm here to ask for your help as well, because I'm up against some pretty impressive people, if you measure impressiveness by personal wealth. I'm not a billionaire. I'm not a millionaire. I might be a thousandaire. It sort of depends on what my house is worth right now. I'm not totally sure. And I'm not going to be able to write a $50 million check to my campaign like the check that Bruce Rauner wrote to his campaign in December, or a $250,000 check to my campaign like the check that Chris Kennedy wrote to his campaign in March, or a $7 million check to my campaign like the check that J.B. Pritzker wrote to his campaign on a Friday afternoon in April. And when he wrote that check late on a Friday afternoon, I went home and had kind of a long, sad weekend talking with my wife, Karen, about what that meant. And like, is this a thing that we can even go up against? And do we have the tools to compete in this environment? But on the other hand, if we don't, what does that mean for our community and our family, our children, our state, the future of politics? Where's the Democratic Party going? And so after thinking about it long and hard, we decided we're in too. And so on Monday, I wrote myself a $25 check. I don't know why that's funny. It was a hard decision, but I'm all in, gosh darn it. But I didn't just write the check. I took a picture of it, and I put the picture on Facebook. And the next thing I knew, we were getting $25 contributions from all across Illinois. from everywhere in Illinois, from people who had never heard of me before, from people who didn't know my positions on all the issues, but from people who sensed, like we sense, that the system is not working for most of us, that our government is owned by millionaires and billionaires and run for millionaires and billionaires. $25 contributions for people who just want to have a stake in a campaign, knowing that if we all own a campaign together, that will give us a government that we all own together. And I think if we do that, we'll have the ability to transform Illinois. The ideas we've been talking about tonight are real big. They're real big. And by the way, I'm not going to get all of them done in one 4-year term, but we're talking about transformative stuff. Transformative in terms of where the money comes from, and transformative in terms of who we invest in and how, and what economic opportunity looks like in Illinois. I think we're not going to achieve that just by beating Bruce Rauner. We're going to achieve that by building a people's movement with the strength and power and courage to demand those transformations out of our government. That's what I'm running to achieve. And there's absolutely no point in trying without people across the state participating. And so I'm here to respectfully and humbly but enthusiastically ask for your help in building that movement. Ask you to join in that effort, ask you to be a part of that team, because I think if we do this right, our state will benefit for a long, long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Biss. I mean, this is, we really appreciate this completely unfiltered, you going out in front of us and taking any question, that we can throw out. And I'm thanking everybody that stayed here, for the duration, because this is our democracy, folks. This is what we're all about. Mr. Biss, you can come to any of our meetings anytime. This has been a delight. Thank you very much. Okay. Hey, who's running this thing? I just wandered on stage. So, Maggie, was there anything else on the agenda we needed to cover? Okay, hang out with us if you want to, and I'll be hanging around. I have to finish my second Chardonnay, so I'm going to be here for a while. But thanks again. Thanks so much for coming. There's a lot you could be doing on a beautiful summer night, and you stayed here. We're just so grateful for it. Thank you guys so much.